Memories of Warladins, statue healers, and other goofy stuff from vanilla. Yes, all of this from a Deadmines clear. This is MultimediaJay radio style for Sunday, September 8th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay radio style.
A little unfinished business from yesterday's discussion. First and foremost, none of the operational issues with the game yesterday had anything whatsoever to do with my discussion about the slow decline of WoW Classic has begun. The DDoS and server issues that took the service down for hours Saturday evening had nothing to do with my discussion. It all happened afterwards. I already had it recorded and uploaded by the time all that stuff was happening. When I talk about the slow decline of WoW Classic, I'm talking about the new toy effect wearing off and the demographics of the game changing away towards a more enthusiast crowd as the post-launch hype after the launch of WoW Classic dies down. So none of yesterday's operational issues had anything whatsoever to do with my discussion or any bearing on it whatsoever. Also, I completely forgot to mention the other source of empty servers right now, people complaining about low pop realms. There are people that play on maybe servers that never got past medium pop and they weren't all that big to begin with, and now with the drop-off happening, maybe they play during off hours or something and the server's getting pretty empty. But I completely forgot to mention that there are some low-population servers out there which are the result of failed free character moves off of streamer servers. Yeah. So, basically, Blizzard, unfortunately, is going to have to solve this with a two-step process, not necessarily one round of FCMs. Because, big surprise, streamer fans don't want to leave the streamer servers. And I don't really think people on streamer servers are playing all that seriously anyways. I think they're just there for the streamers, so they can maybe, say hello to them when they're raiding or join their raid team or something. But for the most part, I think once a server becomes a streamer server, like Fairlina, it's all over. The entire dynamics of everything has changed, and if you don't want to be part of that, then you definitely shouldn't be playing on a streamer server. But what happened was, there were some free character moves available for people that wanted to leave the streamer servers, and only, of course, the people that didn't want to be on the streamer server left. The others would rather put up with queues than leave the streamer server, so basically the folks that left wound up on a rather empty realm, and that is exactly the reason why Blizzard needs to do this in two phases. First, there need to be character moves off of the streamer servers for whoever doesn't want to put up with all the streamer server nonsense to leave the server. And then they need to bring over character moves from a non-streamer high-pop server to make up the difference. And even then, of course, what I've seen over the years with free character moves is that very often people don't want to leave high-pop servers. It's part of the nature of having servers to begin with, as opposed to some kind of mega server or something along those lines like some newer games have, like ESO and Guild Wars 2. So now that all that old business is finally taken care of, let's talk about this weird picture and why I have it. So it's basically a PowerPoint creation of mine, combining together a picture with lots of colors and stuff of the statues in Stormwind with a picture that I put up on Twitter of my parse for damage from the Deadmines run that I just completed. Finally! I met a group of good people that knew what they were doing, that actually would take somebody who looks like a ret paladin, yet has the mana pool of a holy paladin through the Deadmines. And needless to say, once you actually get your chance with one of these underdog hybrid specs, that's when you can really shine. So with the first clear of Van Cleef on WoW Classic for me, I decided to kind of just reminisce on some memories from vanilla and talk about some things that probably haven't been talked about in a long time. They used to be something people talked about in-game and on the forums, but again, this whole thing with classic versus vanilla, there are going to be some differences. And some of the differences I appreciate with the experience that the player base has with MMOs nowadays. It's really nice to be able to play a character with buffs without everybody whining at you everywhere you go. So that was a thing back in the original game. I don't know if it's going to come back or not, but it's nice. Kings, please. Might, please. Wisdom, please. Hey, mage, can I have some food? Soulstone, please. Yeah, even the warlocks couldn't get away with it. It's just, you know, a lot of people talk about how vanilla had a great sense of community. People talk to each other. Yeah. How much of that do you folks that say that remember? Because you remember the good things people said and the ways people worked together, and not the endless whining for buffs and food and all kinds of other stuff because people were lazy and didn't want to support themselves as they played their characters. Give me a break. So, as part of this thinking about the not-so-good old days, I want to talk about statue priests and Warladins. Two of my pet peeves from the original game, which I hope I don't see too much of in this classic HD remake as far as I'm concerned. That's what it is. That's what I'm playing. That's what settings I have for the game and stuff like that. And I hope I don't run into too many of these old, tired arguments anymore. So first, how about we define our terms as to what the heck these things are? So, in Paladin Land, in the early renditions of the game, this was a thing in vanilla, and it was a thing in Burning Crusade as well. There was a huge argument over whether Paladins trying to actually do damage should have intellect on their gear. If you've seen my Retribution the Bad Old Days, various videos that I've uploaded, one of them is the raw gameplay, and the other has commentary. You'll notice that my guy has some serious mana problems, and that's because Blizzard fixed Retribution in vanilla in baby steps. And this is something I sharply disagree with a lot of commentators today who are pretending they actually know something about the early days of WoW, but give away through their commentary that they totally did not play WoW or BC or a Paladin or anything of that sort back then. Blizzard fixed Ret in baby steps. One step was removing intellect from Ret Paladin gear, which caused all kinds of problems because until the revamp in Lich King, which allowed for judging and getting mana back that way, Ret Paladins were basically arms warriors that ran out of mana. And this is, if you look at the numbers here, the pink bar is me, 53 DPS, 44,000 total damage, about a few thousand behind the mages and stuff, but my guy was doing hybrid stuff. First off, when the priest was drinking, my guy was healing, and he's more than capable of doing that with 1,000+ mana in the early 20s, because my guy's actually stacking intellect. I'm doing a lot with auction house greens, of course, being early in the progression curve, and focusing specifically on gear that has both strength and intellect. Guerrilla gear, if you will. Something that I did not notice until Burning Crusade, but apparently if it's in Classic, it was in the original vanilla game too. So when I went nuts about the auction house in order to buy gear for my guy, I should have taken note of this. But I didn't know anything about itemization back then. By the time I was bored with the game at level 40, I was a Holy Paladin with Holy Shock. Yay, a ranged attack. Woo! And I had 200 in every stat. So, strength, agility, stamina, intellect, spirit, 200 of everything. I'm like, yeah, I'm a jack of trades character. Yeah, I didn't have a clue what I was doing. Not the case this time. And that's probably the reason why Deadmines seemed a lot easier than it was the first time I went through in vanilla. A lot of the hurdle, though, to getting this dungeon run done was getting over the retail mentality that still is creeping into Classic, which needs to go away. Folks, I'll spoil it for you now because you need it spoiled if you're coming over from BFA. The specs in BFA just accent part of what your class does. The thing where you're a Holy Paladin or a Retribution Paladin or a Protection Paladin instead of just a Paladin who specializes in one of those three, that's the result of the modern game. That's the result of whenever that revamp was done that made it so, I think it might have been Cataclysm, where you choose your spec at level 10, and then that defines you the entire rest of the game. Basically, or maybe it was Mists of Pandaria when the talent system was reworked. But this whole thing with overemphasis on spec, I think given the number differences between the games, considering what Ian Hazakostas was talking about before Classic launched, and I was kind of second-guessing this whole overemphasis on spec as opposed to class, I think we might see a rollback of that if he really does an about-face because of how popular Classic is right now versus the modern game. If that happens, then what I'm talking about here for Classic will start applying more in the modern game as well, so it might be good to listen up. But that's the thing. I'm going in there with a two-hander. Look like a Retribution Paladin, am spec'd like a Retribution Paladin, but that's because my build the build that I'm going for is going to be Holy Ret, and Retribution is going up to Seal of Command and Pursuit of Justice for the movement speed increase, which is cool to have when you're spending 2/3 of running around Azeroth on foot. 2/3 of the leveling curve is on foot. Paladins don't get their free mount until 40. Warlocks too. So I'd say a run speed increase would definitely come in handy. Plus, the stuff that I took also buffs the mana efficiency of Seals and Judgment, which is the Paladin rotation when doing any kind of damage in the first place. Then all the rest of the points will be in Holy, and I'll reprise a lot of what I used to take in the original vanilla game, but this time doing Retribution first for a couple of key things. So a lot of the damage difference overall between myself and the two mages, even though I topped them in DPS single target, is because the mages all had AoE. There's Frost Nova, and there's Arcane Explosion in play, even though it's Deadmines. So these folks were going in there and they're just blowing up all the trash mobs with tons of AE. And the only way that I could have competed with that was if I had spec'd Holy instead, which I would have gotten Consecrate 11 points in. But Consecrate sucks. It doesn't crit, and it's more of a mana sucker. And that's one of the things with the old school versions of Paladins in WoW as well, is a lot of their damage abilities outside of Retribution don't crit. So it's just a flat X amount with Seal of Righteousness or whatever. It's really terrible. It's only good if you're using Righteous Fury to do some tanking and stuff. But the big thing is, I did more of the Jack of Trades thing in the original game. Now I'm a lot more focused. There's two main things I want my guy to be able to do. Smash the heck out of stuff and heal people. Because as a hybrid, Paladins don't get to wand for token damage when nobody needs to be healed. So you have to make up for it somehow. And there's an old trick from the early parts of the game with rank 1 Seal of Command if you have a two-hander. Seal of Command was made for aka Seal of Casino. Makes your guy do the equivalent of a heroic strike every so often. And it does holy damage, and most importantly, Seal of Command can crit. The important part of this is the proc for Seal of Command that makes your guy do this giant weapon swing that can crit is something that stays no matter what rank you use. It's only the judgment damage that really goes up when you buy the higher ranks of the spell later on. So, later in the game, I could be healing a dungeon group and using rank 1 Seal of Command and trying to twist heals between swings of the two-hander and help with the damage that way. And probably, as we can see from these numbers, get some better results than the priest with his 20 DPS at the bottom. I mean, the two mages were solidly in the 40s. My guy made it into the 50s, but he has no AoE, so that's all single target. And it's only when Seal of Command is proccing on a regular basis. But that's because I actually buy gear for my guy and keep his gear current, so I'm not a drain on the team. Any way I can gear up without having to rely on dungeons, I will do so, and that way I'll go into the dungeons more prepared. If something's available on the auction house, I'll get that first and then upgrade to whatever the dungeon drops. I just don't like to be a burden on my team. And the folks I ran with, whose guild I joined afterwards, really appreciated it. And then, of course, you have the warrior tank underneath. Tanks take a damage penalty in the early parts of the game, but he was still up there, 36 DPS, but he was also a couple levels higher than everybody else. So having a solid tank really sets a nice little solid foundation for the group to be successful. And then you have the priest at the bottom with 20 DPS but he did mostly healing, but he could have probably cast his regular spells too. I don't think he realized exactly how hybrid I was going to be, because if he ran out of mana, I would just start healing people until he had a chance to drink. So it's just, and this is the kind of gameplay, especially at the lower levels, when things aren't specialized as much. This is the kind of hybrid gameplay that is lost in today's World of Warcraft, where your spec basically says, you're this and nothing else. Being able to actually be creative with your character, have more rich lore behind your character because they have a combination background like what my guy has in both healing and fighting at the same time. This is all stuff that is lost in the modern game, where your spec basically cookie cutters you for the entire rest of the game. If you can figure something out that works, people will be surprised by it, because you don't have to stick to something cookie cutter, except maybe in a min-max environment like raids. But I know what the meta was for vanilla. I know what the raiding was like. You raided, and then you farmed for consumables the rest of the time. I don't know if I even want to raid at this point until I get super bored with the 5-man dungeons, because the consumables required in vanilla and BC, bleh, yeah, I was never a fan of that. I'm not really in a position right now to be able to play this game like a full-time job when it comes to consumable farming when it's not time to raid, so I don't see myself being any kind of hardcore progression raider anytime soon. Maybe I'll get into it, maybe I won't. But as it stands right now, my focus is on the smaller formats, which means get a dungeon set or something like that and keep a two-hander handy for Seal of Command for mana-efficient damage and things along those lines. As you can see from these numbers, at Deadmines level, Paladins are still very much keeping up with the pack. I think everyone else starts scaling up better later in the game, though. But here's the thing with the whole Warladin controversy. Yeah, it's about time we got to it, right? Well, this is primarily about memories and stuff, more so than sticking to a script, so it'd be nice to have these kinds of discussions. The Warladin controversy is whether Paladins should use any intellect or whatnot. And there was a big fight about getting the intellect removed from the gear because they can resemble arms warriors more if there were more points put into strength on the gear and not so much put into intellect. But one of the things with Retribution in the original game is that the so-called DPS that Ret Paladins do is uncontrollable random number generator burst damage. So if you stack strength and stamina, number one, you're going to need tons of consumables because your mana pool is going to be tiny. So you're basically going to be an arms warrior that runs out of mana every other fight or something. Hopefully you have enough potions to keep you going. But I think there's even a rudimentary version of potion sickness, I think, where you have to wait like 30 seconds before you can drink another one or something. I don't know. But anyways, bottom line is the intellect gives you more longevity in a longer fight because you go that much longer before you have to drink something. And in my guy's case, because I know that uncontrollable burst damage through Seal of Command can be a tank's worst nightmare when it comes to managing threat, I level that off a bit and spread the damage out a little more by using Blessing of Wisdom instead. And when it comes to the improved blessings later in the tree, I'm actually, when I get down into Holy, going to take Improved Blessing of Wisdom and not Improved Blessing of Might in the Retribution tree. Makes no sense from the Warladins' perspective, but if you play a hybrid, you're playing a hybrid in this game. There'll be a hybrid tax even if you try to chase after the so-called pure classes, a concept that I very much disagree with. Even warriors are hybrid classes because they can also tank. I think a lot of the discussion of pures versus hybrids was just elitism in the early parts of the game, but that's another discussion altogether. Bottom line is, I already know what the meta was in the original game. I already know what cookie cutter stuff to do to min-max my way into raids. What I'm curious about with Classic is, after all these years of experience, how far can I go with maybe a not-so-min-maxed underdog build? Like, for example, being a paladin healer, but still wearing plate mail later in the game, going for the dungeon set, tier set stuff, instead of stacking cloth all over the place. That's what I'm curious about, because I know it's a static world with static progression. I already know what to min-max in order to be like some min-max raid heal bot or buff bot or something along those lines. I already know how people cheesed their way through the game in the original game. I'm curious as to what I can do with things the way the developers seem to intend it. Like, for example, hybrids wearing hybrid gear as opposed to paladins only having strength and stamina because they're chasing after the warriors with their gear and stuff along those lines. I know the reverse was quite a thing, where warriors got upset if they had to take a piece of intellect plate because, oh crap, I gotta take pally gear. But that's not to say the whole Warladin controversy about whether or not paladins should stack intellect wasn't a thing. As a matter of fact, I think it was even worse than warriors being upset because, whoops, they had to take a piece with some intellect and now they'll train their weapon skills a little faster. But they'll still get a sizable bonus to strength and stamina until they get a piece of gear that's more tuned to, a warrior with a rage bar. So, the other reason that I'm doing this is because of the whole problem with statue priests, as I called them back in the original game. The reason why I say statue priests, even though it should probably be statue healers, is priests were the principal healing class in the original game. It was right there in the manual. Paladins and druids can heal, but none can heal as well as the priest. Very often in the early game, and this is why I know there's a difference between vanilla and classic, When a group was looking to get a healer, they would not say looking for healer for Deadmines. They would specify specifically looking for priest for Deadmines. Paladins that tried to heal face an uphill battle to get into groups, as did druids. Matter of fact, resto druids were like the silver medal version of a priest. And shadow priests would get guffawed to no end. You should have rolled a warlock. Waste of a priest. Why don't you get a real spec, you noob? So, this is one of the boons of the more mature retail mindset making its way into Classic, that resto druids or paladins can be considered a healer in dungeon groups. Oh man. I remember running Oldemon in vanilla and the priest was getting mad at my guy because I was actually trying to heal. Like, what the heck? You're a paladin. You shouldn't be trying to be any kind of healer. Your heals cost more. Yeah. Anyways, the statue priest phenomenon was basically because the game had a dedicated Grandmaster of Healing class, aka the priest. Priests would often be like, well, I guess I'm always going to be a healer all the time, and they would always stand there, just watch until somebody needed to be healed. So they wouldn't contribute anything. They'd just stand there and wait to push their healing buttons, even though they had wands. Wand DPS is nothing special. Yeah, but it's better than nothing. That's the thing. Which is faster? A run where some of the damage is coming from the tank and most of the damage is coming from 2 DPS and the healer just stands there, or a run where the healer can contribute to clearing the instance and downing mobs and bosses as well, even if they're mana conservative with the attacks they choose. And if there's a secondary healer in the party, something that no longer exists thanks to the changes to mana pools in the modern game, you can have an environment like what we have, where the hybrid jumps in on the healing while the priest is drinking, or if the priest wants to do some real damage. Really, healing comes down to who has the mana still. And we didn't have anywhere close to mana issues. Also, this also took some getting used to, but when the Deadmines folks ran in while the priest was drinking, they were a little skittish. I don't think they realized that my guy had more than enough mana to just do healing until the priest came back in, and then start smashing stuff on the trash pulls. But this whole statue priest thing, now that I've become more familiar with vanilla and wanding and what wanding has and what the hybrids can do to contribute token damage, like what I'm doing with rank 1 Seal of Command, I now have to conclude that the statue priests I knew in the original game were lazy, entitled whiners who wanted to be carried through the content. And this continued into more recent expansions, raids, which, by the way, dominated the mindset of people even in the smaller formats where people don't have to be as specialized. And all those arguments, whenever Blizzard tried to allow for healers to be more like combat healers, particularly after the monk was introduced in Mists of Pandaria and fist weaving was still a thing, same thing with the discipline priest as well. All the whining and complaining about, don't make me DPS. I didn't roll a healer to DPS. Please don't make me DPS. Yeah, go suck on your pacifier and stand in the corner, statue healers. I'll gladly take your spot and the runs will be faster. Because imagine this, 53 DPS. I did some testing after the run. I could get that just from Seal of Command procs, never mind the judgment, which isn't all that great unless the mob is stunned. So I imagine if I played my cards right, I could probably stay closer to the DPS while also healing the party if I really knew what I was doing and maybe brought a few potions because my guy has a lot of intellect but is middle of the road on spirit. But Paladins are more about MP5 in the early parts of the games, mana per 5 for those of you that don't know the lingo, than stacking spirit anyways. The whole thing with concentration and stuff, not concentration aura, but the thing that allows a certain percentage of your mana regeneration to continue in combat, that's more of a priest thing. Paladins and shamans had more MP5 type stuff that they were looking for as opposed to spirit. It's one of the reasons why MP5 was eliminated later in the game's history, because it was kind of a redundant progression path for regeneration as opposed to spirit. So it's just extra complexity that divided up the loot tables and stuff, and some classes wanted MP5, some didn't. Some classes wanted spirit and some didn't. It was just didn't really need to be there. The two systems really didn't need to exist apart from one another. They both did the same thing. The only difference was who was interested in which type of regeneration. But all things considered, though, when it comes to how to play hybrids, and the whole thing with statue healers and Warladins, one of the things I'm looking forward to with Classic is answering the questions I had back in the earlier parts of the game about just how far I could go with some of these maverick character setups as opposed to the whining about the meta that was going on in Green Chat, Trade Chat, and on the forums as well. I heard more than my share of paladins getting made fun of because Ret Paladin, you're useless. You don't do any damage. You suck. And it'll be particularly interesting to see how many weird looks my guy continues getting when they see somebody who can do a lot of healing running around with a two-hander. Welcome back to the original game. Caster itemization, where it wasn't worth meleeing with a caster weapon, was more of a thing in Burning Crusade. Even for the hybrids, you'll see all kinds of different stats on hybrid gear, including a mixture of strength and intellect. What can I say? Classic is a very different game, even from the modern game a couple of expansions ago. That needs to be respected, and the old rules, which really aren't so old, that people adhere to in the modern game, yeah, it's a different ball game in Classic. And one of the things I like about the Classic service is that this lets me finally answer some of the questions I had back in the original game about how far I could go with some of the stuff that I had in mind back then, as opposed to all the whining about, if you're not this build, and if you're not using a one-hander and shield, we don't want you in our group because you suck. I'm guessing any OG folks who played vanilla are hopefully older, wiser, and more mature now to realize that the stuff people whined about back in the original game was a long time ago. And who knows what today's player base, with today's experience and today's mindset, can do with this 15-year-old-ish game. Let's see what my underdog characters can do. Besides this fighter-healer paladin, I'm actually going to try an old-school discipline priest from before the tree had any focus. I'm also looking to try a survival hunter, which can alternate between ranged attacks and melee, deadly at any range. Because we already know how to beat the game. We already know how everybody beat the game with the cheese ball, this always works stuff back in the day. It's time to get a little more creative and have a little more fun along the way, instead of just, let me punch this into Thoughtbot real quick. Oh, I'm supposed to wear this, do this, and have this build. Close the book, I ain't doing anything else. In some ways, indeed, Classic is not vanilla. Thanks for listening, everybody. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.